The Wilhelm Gustloff was built to be the proof that National Socialism kept its promises. That was her entire reason for existing, and for a few years she performed it perfectly. She was the flagship of a Nazi organization called Strength Through Joy, a vast state scheme meant to show the ordinary German worker that the new Germany had been built for him. She was a cruise liner, and she was designed around a single idea that was, for its time, genuinely radical. She had no classes. There was no first class and no steerage, no grand suites for the rich, and no cramped holds for the poor. Every cabin aboard her was much the same as every other, because the point of her was to embody the national community the regime was always talking about. The notion that under Hitler, the factory worker and the office clerk were one people, equal, sailing together. Tens of thousands of ordinary Germans were given subsidized holidays aboard her, and ships like her, cruises to Norway and the Atlantic Islands, and they came home having been shown, in the most tangible possible way, that the state had done something for them. She was a floating advertisement for the Third Reich, and she was named after a Nazi official who had been shot dead in Switzerland and turned into a martyr, and she was, for a while, one of the most effective pieces of propaganda the regime ever launched. 8 years later, she was the instrument of the worst maritime disaster in the history of the world, and she killed the very people she had been built to flatter. On the 30th of January 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff sailed out of a Baltic port, crammed with something in the region of 10,000 human beings, and almost all of them were the ordinary Germans the ship had been built for, women and children and the old and the wounded, fleeing westward from the Red Army in the last winter of the war. A few hours out, a Soviet submarine put 3 torpedoes into her, and she went to the bottom of the freezing Baltic in about an hour, and around 9,000 of the people aboard her died. 9,000. It is the largest loss of life in a single ship sinking that has ever occurred, roughly 6 times the toll of the Titanic, more than the Titanic and the Lusitania put together and then doubled again. Roughly half of the dead were children. About 1,200 people lived, in the ice and the dark, in numbers so large that no one has ever been able to count them exactly. This is the story of what it was to be aboard her in those hours, and it is above all the story of the conditions, of the specific hell of 10,000 people packed into a ship built for 2, and then put into the winter sea. Begin with the ship, because the gap between what she had been and what she became is the whole of it. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a big ship for her purpose, but not an enormous one, a little over 680 feet long, around 25,000 tons. She had been built to carry, in comfort, about 1,450 passengers and something over 400 crew, call it 1,900 souls all told, and to carry them in the classless ease that was her selling point, with a cinema and a music hall and lounges and, on one of her lower decks, a swimming pool, tiled and drained and filled as needed, a luxury for the workers of the Reich. 1,900 people, in a ship with the room and the boats and the life jackets and the plumbing for 1,900 people. Hold that number in your mind, because everything that happened on the 30th of January happened, because the ship that had been designed around that number was made, on that day, to hold more than 5 times it. In her few years as what she was meant to be, she had done the job well. Between 1938 and the outbreak of war, she made cruise after cruise, carrying ordinary German workers, chosen and subsidized through their workplaces and the labor front, on holidays most of them could never otherwise have dreamed of, north to the Norwegian fjords and south to Madeira and the Italian coast. The idea was carefully calculated. A worker who had been given a sea cruise by the state was a worker who felt he had a stake in the state, and the regime understood the value of that better than almost anything, and the ship was fitted out to drive the point home. There were no locked-off decks for a wealthy elite, because there was supposed to be no elite. The man from the factory floor ate in the same dining room and walked the same promenade and swam in the same pool as everyone else aboard. It was a floating vision of the national community the propaganda promised, a Germany without classes, all pulling together under one flag, and for the tens of thousands who sailed in her, it was a powerful experience, a week of being treated as though the future the regime kept describing had actually arrived. That was the Wilhelm Gustloff people remembered from before the war, a bright, white, happy ship full of ordinary Germans on holiday. It is worth holding that image beside the one that was coming, because the same ordinary Germans, or people exactly like them, would be aboard her at the end, and the ship that had been built to show them how much the state valued them would carry most of them to the bottom of the sea, while the state that had built her looked away. When the war came, she stopped being a holiday ship almost at once. For a short time, she served as a hospital ship, painted white with red crosses, and then in 1940, the Navy took her, painted her gray, stripped her of that role, and moored her at the port of Gotenhafen on the Baltic coast of occupied Poland as a floating barracks. And there she sat for more than 4 years, tied up, her engines cold and silent, a gray accommodation hulk housing the trainees of a submarine school. She had been built to move, to cruise, to show herself off in foreign harbors, and instead she spent the heart of the war as a stationary dormitory, her cinema and her ballroom and her tiled pool given over to the bunks and the routines of young men learning to crew U-boats. Her sea days were behind her, and by January 1945, there was probably no one who expected her to make a real voyage ever again. Then the war came to Gotenhafen, and the whole eastern edge of Germany began to run. To understand the ship, you have to understand the panic that filled her, and the panic was not irrational. In the summer and autumn of 1944, the Red Army had driven west across the old front and into German territory, into East Prussia, the easternmost province of the Reich. And stories had begun to come back with the first refugees, stories of what happened to German civilians when the front rolled over them. Some of those stories were exaggerated by the Nazi propaganda machine, which wanted the population to fight rather than flee, and some of them were entirely true. And to the people living in the path of the advance, it did not much matter which, because the terror was the same either way. By January 1945, East Prussia was being cut off, encircled, the land routes west closing one by one, and millions of German civilians found themselves trapped against the Baltic coast, with the vengeful army coming on behind them in the depth of winter. Their only way out was the sea. So, the German Navy launched the largest sea evacuation in history, and almost no one has ever heard of it. It was called Operation Hannibal, and over about 15 weeks from January into the spring of 1945, the Navy and the Merchant Marine used every hull that would float to lift German soldiers and civilians off the Baltic coast and carry them west, out of the reach of the Red Army. By the end, they had moved something between 800,000 and 2 million people, a sea lift several times the size of the British evacuation from Dunkirk conducted in winter, under air attack, through waters seeded with mines and patrolled by submarines. It has been called the German Dunkirk, and it was far larger than Dunkirk, and it is largely forgotten for the same reason the Gustloff is largely forgotten, which is that it was a German catastrophe in a war that Germany had started, and it fit no one's story afterward. Into that operation, the old Wilhelm Gustloff was pressed, her engines woken after 4 years, to make one voyage west, packed with refugees. To grasp who was standing on that pier, you have to grasp what they had already been through to reach it. The people crowding into Gotenhafen had come out of East Prussia and the lands along the coast in the dead of one of the coldest winters of the century, on foot and in farm carts and on sledges, in long columns that stretched for miles along the frozen roads, driving what livestock they could and carrying what they could lift, with the sound of the guns behind them growing closer. Old men and women and children made those treks, because the young men were gone to the war, and people froze to death on the roads, and infants died in their mothers' arms in the carts, and the columns were strafed from the air and in places overrun by the advancing tanks. Some of the refugees reaching the coast had crossed the frozen lagoon called the Frisches Haff, a wide, shallow inlet that had iced over, walking miles across the ice under fire, with the ice cracking and carts and families going through it into the freezing water below. By the time these people reached Gotenhafen, they had already survived one hell to get there, had already in many cases lost family members to the cold and the ice and the guns, and they arrived at the port frozen, exhausted, half-starved, and utterly desperate, with nothing left in the world but the hope of a place on a ship going west. That is who was fighting to get aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff. Not soldiers, not for the most part. Women with children and old people, and the walking wounded of a broken province, the survivors of a catastrophe on land, who now wanted only to reach the sea in safety, and who saw in the great gray ship at the pier the thing that would finally carry them out of the nightmare. It carried most of them into a worse one. And so, we come to the pier at Gotenhofen in the last days of January 1945, which is where the horror really begins, because the horror begins with the loading. Picture the port. It is the end of January on the Baltic, and the temperature is around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is snowing, and tens of thousands of refugees are jammed into the harbor area, having walked or ridden or crawled to the coast ahead of the Russians, many of them having already endured days or weeks of flight across a frozen landscape, many having already lost people on the way. They are camped on the quays in the cold, waiting, and the thing they are waiting for is a place on a ship, any ship, and the Wilhelm Gustloff is the great prize among the ships, because she is huge and famous and she looks safe. One survivor remembered the saying that went around the piers, that to have a ticket for the Gustloff was to have half your salvation already. They called her the Ark. To get aboard her felt like being saved. The pier itself was its own kind of hell before anyone even reached the ship. Tens of thousands of people were pressed into the harbor area in the freezing cold, and there were not remotely enough ships, and so there was a slow, desperate, days-long struggle simply to get from the quay onto a gangway, a crush of humanity in which families were separated in the press, in which people who had walked 100 miles together lost one another in the last 100 yards. There are accounts of mothers who handed their small children up over the heads of the crowd to be passed aboard, and were then unable to reach the gangway themselves, so that child and mother were parted at the very moment of what was supposed to be their salvation. The child carried aboard the ship, and the mother left on the pier, or the reverse. There are accounts of people trampled in the crush on the quay. Everyone was frantic to get aboard the Gustloff in particular, because she was the biggest and looked the safest, and the pressure of that desire built up against her gangways for days. And for those who made it aboard, the relief was enormous and, we now know, entirely misplaced. They had won a place on the one ship, out of the whole evacuation fleet, that would suffer the worst disaster of them all. To have fought your way aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff in those last days of January 1945 felt like the greatest luck in the world and was very nearly a death sentence. The loading went on for days, and the ship filled far past anything her builders had imagined. The Navy had first intended her to carry the men of the submarine training division and a body of naval personnel, and those came aboard in an orderly way and were counted. Over 900 officers and men of the U-boat school, 170-odd other naval auxiliaries, and 373 young women of the Naval Auxiliary Service. Girls, really, many of them in their late teens and early 20s, who were quartered together in the one large empty space available to them, the drained swimming pool on E-deck, low in the ship. Then the wounded came aboard, over 160 badly injured soldiers being evacuated from the collapsing front. And then, from the 25th of January, the ship was open to the refugees, and they poured in. They came aboard until there was, quite literally, no more room, and then more came. It is worth pausing on the mixture of humanity that filled her, because it is part of what made the loss so total. There were the 900-odd young submariners of the training division, most of them fit young men, and they had the best chance of anyone aboard, and a good number of them took it. There were the 373 young women of the Naval Auxiliary, quartered in the drained pool at the very bottom of the ship, in the worst possible place. There were the wounded soldiers, over 160 of them, men who could not walk or could barely walk, evacuated from the front, who had almost no chance at all of getting up through a sinking listing ship in the dark. And there were the thousands upon thousands of refugees, the women and the old people and the children, the ordinary Germans the ship had been built for, who filled every remaining space. It was a cross-section of a nation in collapse, the soldier and the sailor and the wounded and the auxiliary and the grandmother and the infant, all pressed together into one hull, and when the hull went down, it took nearly all of them without distinction, the fit young sailor's odds counting for something, and the wounded man's and the small child's counting for almost nothing, and the sea making its own pitiless sorting among them. The registration officials counted them as they boarded, and by the afternoon of the 29th of January, the count had reached 7,956 people, and at that point, the officials simply stopped counting because the situation had passed beyond counting. People kept coming aboard after that, through gangways and, it was said, through every opening they could find, mothers handing babies up to strangers, families forcing their way into a ship that was already solid with human beings, and no one recorded their numbers, and no one ever could. The best reconstruction anyone has ever managed, made decades later by a survivor who devoted his life to it, put the total at 10,582 people aboard when she sailed. Of those, nearly 9,000 were refugees, civilians, and of the refugees, something on the order of 4,000 to 5,000 were children. A ship built for 1900 carried more than 10,000, and half of the excess were children. Now, hold that ship in your mind as it was on the morning she sailed, because that is the reality this whole account is about. Every cabin, built for 2 or 4, held far more. The corridors were lined with people sitting and lying along both sides, leaving a narrow channel to step through, and the channel itself had people in it. The cinema was full of refugees. The music hall was full. The dining rooms, the lounges, the stairwells, the landings, every enclosed public space on the ship had been turned into a dormitory of bodies, people packed against people, sitting on their bundles, on the floor, on the stairs. The glassed-in promenade deck, a long enclosed gallery running down the side of the ship, was crammed end to end with refugees, hundreds upon hundreds of them, and that detail matters terribly, as we will see, because that enclosed gallery was a beautiful place to shelter from the cold and a death trap when the ship went down. The heat of all those bodies made the interior of the ship stifling and close and foul, thick with the smell of 10,000 unwashed people and wet clothing and sickness, and a great many of the refugees, who had never been to sea in their lives, were already seasick before the ship even cleared the harbor in a rising winter gale. Feeding and tending that many people was simply impossible, and no real attempt could be made. A ship provisioned and staffed to serve meals to 1,900 passengers had 10,000 aboard, and there was no way to cook for them or to distribute food to them through corridors packed solid with bodies. And so, people lived on what they had carried aboard and shared what they had, and many went hungry. The sanitary arrangements, built for 1,900, collapsed under 10,000 within hours, and the reality of that, in the enclosed and overheated spaces below, does not need to be spelled out in detail to be understood. The air grew thick and rank. Children cried and could not be comforted. The seasickness spread as the ship met the open water and the winter swell, and people who were already weak and frightened and packed against strangers were now sick as well, with nowhere to go, and over all of it lay fear, the specific fear of people who knew they were at sea in wartime, who had heard that submarines were about, who could feel the ship rolling and could see how impossibly crowded she was, and who were doing the arithmetic in their own heads about the boats and coming up with the same answer everyone came up with. It was not a voyage. It was a besieged building set adrift, 10,000 people enduring conditions that would have been a scandal for a few hours, and that they were being asked to endure for a passage of days. And beneath the physical misery ran the cold current of dread, because on some level, a great many of them understood exactly how exposed they were. And there were nowhere near enough lifeboats and nowhere near enough life jackets, and everyone who thought about it for a moment knew it. The ship had been designed with boats for 1,900 people. Some of her boats had been lost or removed in her years as a barracks. Some had been replaced with smaller craft. Whatever the exact number, it was a number calculated for a fraction of the 10,000 aboard, and even that inadequate number was, by the 30th of January, partly frozen, because the boats and their davits had iced over in the cold and the sea spray. Life jackets were handed out, but not to everyone, and there were not enough for everyone, and some of the life jackets that were handed out were the standard adult size, which is a detail that would kill children in a particular and unbearable way in a few hours' time. Everyone aboard was, in effect, gambling that nothing would go wrong, because if anything went wrong, there was no version of the arithmetic in which most of them could be saved. There was room in the boats for perhaps a fifth of them on a good day, and this was not a good day. Set the numbers down plainly because the numbers are the whole tragedy in miniature. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a little over 680 feet long and about 25,000 tons, built to carry around 1,900 people. On the 30th of January 1945, she carried, by the best estimate anyone has made, 10,582, of whom nearly 9,000 were civilian refugees, and something like 4,000 to 5,000 were children. The registered count, before counting was abandoned, had already reached 7,956. The water she was about to sail into was around 39 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a person in a matter of minutes. The air temperature that night was somewhere between 0 and 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was snowing, and there were sheets of ice on the sea. She had lifeboats and rafts for a fraction of the people aboard, and some of those were frozen fast. When she was hit, she would sink in about an hour. Around 9,300 people would die, and about 1,200 would live, and the dead would outnumber the dead of the Titanic by roughly 6 to 1. Those are the numbers, and every one of them was a person, and nearly half of them were children. She sailed a little after noon on the 30th of January, and the decisions made in the next few hours sealed the fate of everyone aboard. There was confusion on the bridge from the start because there were 4 captains aboard, and they did not agree. The senior civilian master was an elderly man brought out of retirement. The naval commander of the submarine trainees was a younger officer. There were others, and there was friction about the route, the speed, the precautions. The ship had a single escort, an old torpedo boat, small and worn, and at one point even that was reduced when a second escort had to turn back with a leak. So the largest concentration of human life afloat that night was steaming into submarine-infested waters with one elderly escort and a divided command. The division on the bridge was not a small thing because it touched the very decisions that would decide whether the ship lived. The elderly civilian master and the younger naval officer commanding the submarine trainees held different views about how to make the passage, and a ship with a clear, single, confident command might have handled the coming hours very differently. There was disagreement about speed. The ship was capable of more, and moving faster would have made her a harder target for a submarine. But she was worn from 4 years of lying idle, and her condition and the crowded, half-manned state of things argued for caution, and so she went slower than she might have. There was the question of zigzagging, the standard evasive tactic against submarines, in which a ship steers a constant series of turns so that no submarine can easily predict where she will be. The Gustloff was not zigzagging, but holding a steady course. Each of these choices had a rationale, and each of them, in hindsight, helped to kill her. And the divided command meant that no single person was fully in control of the sum of them. 10,000 lives were riding on the judgment of a bridge that could not entirely agree with itself, steaming slowly and steadily through the dark, showing lights, toward the place where the submarines were waiting. And then 2 decisions were made that between them handed the ship to the enemy. The first was the route. Rather than hug the coast in the shallow water, where a submarine could not easily operate, the ship was taken out into deeper water, partly out of fear of mines and shoals inshore, and in that deeper water, the submarines waited. The second decision was the one that has haunted the story ever since. Word came of German minesweepers supposedly coming the other way, and to avoid a collision in the dark and the snow, someone ordered the ship's navigation lights switched on, her red and green running lights, so that the oncoming vessels would see her. For a while, in the darkness of the Baltic night, the most crowded ship in the world steamed along, showing lights, a line of colored lamps moving across the black water, visible for miles. Whether that was the thing that doomed her can be argued, but it certainly did not help, and she was moving slowly, on a straight and steady course, not zigzagging, an almost perfect target. The submarine was the S-13 of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, and her commander was a man named Alexander Marinesko. He was, by every account, a gifted and reckless officer who was also in serious trouble. He drank heavily. He had been absent without leave. He was under a shadow with his superiors and, some accounts say, under threat of court-martial. And he had gone to see that patrol needing a success badly, needing to bring back a kill that would redeem him. For nearly 3 weeks his patrol had found nothing. And then, on the night of the 30th of January, cruising on the surface in the dark, he saw lights. And beneath the lights a huge shape, a ship far larger than anything he had expected, silhouetted against the faint glow of the distant shore. He could hardly believe the size of it. He brought his boat around and stalked it, and worked into an attacking position on the shoreward side, where he would be least expected. And he closed to about 1,000 yards, and he fired. He fired 4 torpedoes, and each one had been painted by his crew with a slogan. They bore the phrases of Soviet vengeance, for the motherland, for the Soviet people, for Leningrad, the city that had been besieged and starved by the Germans for nearly 900 days, and, on the fourth, for Stalin. 3 of the 4 ran. The fourth, the one marked for Stalin, jammed in its tube and did not launch, and had to be gingerly disarmed by the submarine's crew. A small dark irony that the torpedo dedicated to the dictator was the one that failed. The other 3 crossed the 1,000 yards of black water and struck the Wilhelm Gustloff along her side, and where each one struck tells you who died first. The first torpedo hit forward in the bow, and it struck the part of the ship where the crew were quartered. It sealed off the forward compartments, and it killed or trapped many of the ship's own crew, the sailors, the very men who would have been needed to launch the boats and organize the evacuation. In the first instant, before most of the 10,000 even understood what had happened, the ship lost a large part of the trained hands who might have saved some of them. The second torpedo hit amidships, and it struck the drained swimming pool on E-deck, where the 373 young women of the Naval Auxiliary were quartered. Of the 373, 3 survived. The tiled walls and floor of the empty pool shattered under the explosion, and in that low enclosed space deep in the ship, there was almost no chance for any of them, and almost none of them had one. 3 young women out of 373 came up out of that part of the ship. It is one of the sharpest single images of the whole disaster. An entire company of girls in their late teens and 20s, killed in one blow in the bottom of the ship, in the place that had once been a swimming pool for holidaymakers. The third torpedo hit the engine room, and it killed the ship. It cut the power and the communications at a stroke. The lights went out. The engines stopped. The pumps that might have fought the flooding stopped. The ship's ability to call clearly for help was crippled, and in that instant, the Wilhelm Gustloff became a dark, powerless, listing hulk full of more than 10,000 terrified people, most of whom could now see nothing at all, in the freezing black of a Baltic night. And the water began to come in. What happened next, in the hour that followed, is the part that the survivors could never afterward forget and could never fully describe. The ship took on a list to one side and began to settle by the bow, and in the darkness the 10,000 people packed into her surged for the decks and the boats. Consider what that meant physically. The corridors and stairwells that had been lined with people were now the escape routes for all of them at once, in the dark, with the deck tilting underfoot, and human beings crushed into those spaces in a panic, and people fell, and people were trampled, and people were pinned and could not move, and the very density that had let the ship carry so many now killed them, because there was no way for 10,000 people to move through passages built for 1900. Many of the dead of the Wilhelm Gustloff never reached the open deck at all. They died inside the ship, in the crush on the stairs, in the dark, before they ever saw the sky. And those who did reach the deck came out into a nightmare of a different kind. Up top, there was a screaming wind full of snow, and a deck already leaning hard to one side and growing steeper, and the lifeboats, which everyone was fighting to reach, were largely useless. Some were frozen solid in their iced davits and could not be swung out at all. Some, when the frozen fittings were forced, jammed or capsized and spilled their people into the sea or onto the deck. The list of the ship meant that the boats on the high side could not be launched because they swung inboard against the ship, and the boats on the low side were already close to the rising water. There are accounts of a fully loaded lifeboat, people packed into it, that could not be got away and slid down the tilting deck. There are accounts of the mounting on the deck of one of the ship's own anti-aircraft guns tearing loose and crushing a loaded boat beneath it. Only a small handful of the boats got away cleanly and full. For the overwhelming majority of the 10,000, there was never any real prospect of a place in a boat, which left the sea, and the sea that night was death. The water was around 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and a human being in water that cold has only minutes before the cold takes hold, stops the muscles, stops the heart. People jumped or were washed off, or went into the water when the boats capsized, and the cold began to kill them almost at once. The sea around the sinking ship filled with people, hundreds and then thousands of them, in the dark, in the snow, and their cries carried across the water. And then, over a few minutes, the cries began to thin and to fade as the cold did its work until there was silence where there had been thousands of voices. Survivors said, decades later, that it was the sound they could never get out of their heads, the crying of thousands of people in the freezing water slowly going quiet. And there was a particular horror in the water that has to be told, because it is the truest single detail of the whole disaster. Many of the small children had been put into life jackets, and many of the only life jackets available were the full adult size. An adult life jacket on a small child does not sit right. Its buoyancy is in the wrong place for a small body, and a child who goes into the water in one is liable to be turned by it, tipped over, so that the buoyancy that was meant to save the child holds the child head down in the water instead. Rescuers and survivors described seeing, in the sea around the ship, the life jackets of children floating upright and correct, with the children in them inverted beneath the surface. Thousands of the dead of the Wilhelm Gustloff were children, and a portion of them died in exactly that way, killed by the very thing that was supposed to keep them afloat. It is almost unbearable to state, and it is a documented fact, and it is the reason this disaster sits in a category by itself. Meanwhile, the ship herself was going, and she went in about an hour, and her end had a terrible grandeur to it. She rolled further onto her side and settled by the bow, and thousands of people were still trapped inside her, many of them in that long glassed-in promenade gallery down her side, which had filled with refugees for shelter, and which now became a sealed tank as the ship went over. The people inside it unable to break out through the glass, carried down with the ship. As she made her final plunge, with the sea flooding into her hull, her boilers exploded, and the shock briefly kicked the generators back into life, so that for a few seconds, as she went down, the dying ship suddenly blazed with light, every porthole and every lamp flaring on at once, a ship full of light going bow first into the black water. And then the lights went out for good, and she was gone, down to the bottom in about 140 feet of water, taking the greater part of 10,000 people with her, a little more than an hour after the first torpedo struck. The rescue was as much as the German Navy could manage in the circumstances, and it saved about 1 in 9. Ships of the escort and of a nearby squadron turned toward the sinking and came as fast as they dared, knowing the submarine was still out there. The old escort torpedo boat came back and pulled people from the water. A second torpedo boat, escorting a heavy cruiser, came up and lowered its boats and nets, and it saved several hundred even as it had to dodge torpedoes from the submarine that had done the sinking. The heavy cruiser itself, the Admiral Hipper, came to the scene, but the Hipper was herself packed with 1,500 refugees, and her captain, judging that to stop dead in submarine waters with 1,500 people aboard was to risk a second catastrophe worse than the first, made the agonizing decision not to linger and drew off, leaving people in the water behind him, a choice that some of the survivors never forgave and that the captain had to carry for the rest of his life. Other small craft came and did what they could. In all, the various ships pulled something like 1,200 people alive from the sea in the boats. Everyone else, some 9,000 people, was lost. The men who carried out that rescue did so at real risk to themselves. And it is worth remembering because it is easy to reduce this story to the numbers of the dead and forget the small, desperate acts of the living. The submarine that had sunk the Gustloff was still in the area, and the rescue ships knew it, and to stop dead in the water, to pull people aboard, or to lower boats and nets, was to make yourself the next target. The second torpedo boat that came up, in the middle of hauling frozen and half-drowned people out of the sea, actually had to break off and take evasive action as the submarine fired at it, and then came back and went on rescuing. The crews leaned over the sides and hauled people up by hand, dragged them out of the water, dead weight and stiff with cold, and worked to revive them. And a great many of the people they pulled out died anyway from the cold after they had been brought aboard, because they had been in that water too long. The rescue went on through the freezing night among the wreckage and the bodies, and for every person a rescuer managed to save, there were 7 or 8 he could not reach in time, and the men who did that work carried the memory of the ones they could not reach for the rest of their lives, the same way the survivors carried the sound of the voices in the water. There is one more rescue that stands slightly apart, and it belongs here because it is the one thread of grace in the whole account. Some 7 hours after the ship went down, long after the organized rescue had ended, a small German patrol boat was moving through the empty wreckage-strewn water where the Gustloff had been, making a last sweep, and it came upon a lifeboat that appeared to be empty, just drifting. A petty officer aboard the patrol boat, a man named Werner Fick, climbed across into the derelict boat to check it, and found, wrapped up tightly against the cold in a bundle of blankets on the floor of the boat, a baby, some months old, still alive. It was the last living soul pulled from the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, an infant whose parents were somewhere among the 9,000 dead and were never identified, alone in a drifting boat in the middle of a frozen sea full of the dead. The petty officer who found the child adopted him and raised him as his own son. Out of the largest loss of life in maritime history, that is the last survivor, a baby with no name and no family, found by chance in an empty boat 7 hours later and taken home by the man who found him. And then, almost at once, the whole thing was buried, and stayed buried for the better part of 60 years. The Nazi government did not announce the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. In the last months of the war, with Germany collapsing, the last thing the regime wanted was to broadcast that its own greatest evacuation ship had been sunk with 9,000 of its own people, most of them women and children, so the disaster was simply not reported, folded into the general darkness of a country going down in ruin. On the other side, the Soviet Union did not make much of it either. The sinking of a ship packed overwhelmingly with refugees and children was not the kind of victory a state wished to celebrate too loudly, and the submarine commander who had done it, far from being made a hero at the time, remained under his cloud and was only officially honored decades later, after his death. And in the wider world, once the war was over and the full horror of what Germany had done became known, there was little appetite anywhere to mourn German civilians, even German civilian children, because they had belonged to the nation that had built the death camps, and the suffering of the aggressor is the suffering the world finds hardest to hold in view. So, the largest maritime disaster in history vanished from memory almost completely, remembered only in Germany, and there mostly in private, by the people who had lost someone aboard her. It took a novel, published in Germany in 2002, to bring the Wilhelm Gustloff back into the general consciousness at all. The novel was written by a German who had himself been a boy in that region at the end of the war, and its very subject was the way the disaster had been pushed out of memory, the way no one on any side had wanted to look at it, and it argued in effect that a silence like that does not heal anything but only festers. Around the same time, the questions that had always hung over the sinking were argued again in public. Had it been a war crime? The ship had been carrying more than 1,000 military personnel and was armed with anti-aircraft guns, and she bore no protective markings and had not been declared a hospital or refugee ship. And the submarine commander had no way of knowing, through a periscope in the dark, that the great vessel in his sights was packed overwhelmingly with women and children. By the hard logic of the law, he had attacked a legitimate military target in wartime, and the matter was never treated as a crime. And the man himself, Alexander Marinesko, lived out a hard and troubled life after the war, in and out of favor, dogged by his drinking and his record, dying in relative obscurity in the 1960s. And it was only in 1990, decades after his death, that the Soviet state at last named him a hero of the Soviet Union for the sinking. All of it, the legal argument and the belated medal and the long official silence, sat on top of the same simple, terrible fact, which was that around 9,000 people, most of them civilians and half of them children, had died in the freezing dark, and that the world had found it convenient not to remember them. The ship herself lies where she fell, on the floor of the Baltic off the coast, in about 140 feet of water, broken into pieces by the torpedoes, and by her own sinking, and by the decades. On the navigational charts, she is not even given her name. She is marked coldly as an obstacle on the seabed, a hazard to be avoided. Obstacle number 73. She is an official war grave, protected, and the divers who go down to her, and a few do, find a dark and silted and dangerous wreck tangled with lost fishing nets and human remains, and the scattered belongings of the people who went down with her. And it is by any measure one of the largest tombs on earth, holding the greater part of 9,000 people in a single hull on the bottom of a cold sea. For most of the years since 1945, almost no one came to mourn there, because almost no one was allowed to remember that she was there to be mourned. She was, for the better part of a lifetime, among the largest unmarked graves in the world, out of sight beneath the gray Baltic, holding a number of the dead that the world had rounded down and set aside. But there was one man who never let it go, who spent his whole life refusing to let those 9,000 people disappear uncounted. And he is where this ends. His name was Heinz Schön, and on the night of the sinking, he was an 18-year-old assistant purser aboard the ship. He was one of the 1,200 who lived, And when the war was over, and the ship and its dead had slipped into the silence that swallowed them, Heinz Schön could not let them stay there. He made the Wilhelm Gustloff his life's work. Because no full passenger list had survived the chaos at Gotenhafen, no one actually knew how many people had been aboard, or how many had died. The early official guesses put the dead at around 5,000, and there the matter might have rested forever, a rounded-down number for a rounded-down tragedy. Schön would not accept it. For 60 years, he collected everything he could find, the boarding records that did survive, the testimony of other survivors, the naval documents, the accounts of the rescue ships, and he pieced the ship's final voyage back together, person by person. And with each passing decade, his reconstructed count climbed higher, because the more he found, the more people he found, who had been aboard and had never been counted, uncounted in life and uncounted in death. His final reckoning was that 10,582 people had sailed on the Wilhelm Gustloff, and that around 9,300 of them had died. It is his numbers, arrived at across a lifetime of work, that the world now uses. It cost him something to do it, and it is worth being clear about what the work actually was. It was not a matter of finding one lost document that settled the question. It was decades of painstaking, unglamorous, often grim labor, tracking down survivors one by one across a scattered post-war Germany and beyond, taking down their accounts before they died, and took what they knew with them, cross-checking name against name, sifting the fragments of boarding lists and naval records that had survived, building a picture of a single terrible night out of thousands of small pieces, and living, all the while, inside the memory of the thing he had survived. He wrote it all down, book after book, the most complete account of the disaster that exists, compiling not just the numbers, but the names, as many of the names as could ever be recovered, because a number is a thing the world can look away from, and a name is a person. He turned himself, deliberately, into the memory that the disaster would otherwise not have had, where a whole tragedy had been allowed to blur into a rounded-off figure and a silence. One survivor spent 60 years insisting, with documents, that these had been particular people, this many of them, with these names, and that they had died on this night, in this way, and that it had happened and mattered and would be recorded whether the world wished to look or not. He was, in the end, the man who counted the uncounted, and he could not bear to be parted from them, even by his own death. Heinz Schön died in 2013, an old man who had spent the better part of 70 years in the company of the 9,000, and his last wish was not to be buried in a churchyard among the living, but to be laid to rest with the ship at the wreck, with the people he had spent his life refusing to forget. And so, a team of divers took his ashes down to the Wilhelm Gustloff, to the broken hull lying in the cold and the dark and the silt on the floor of the Baltic, and they placed an urn there and a plaque, so that the boy who had survived her and the man who had counted her dead came at last to rest among them on the bottom of the sea, with the 9,000 and the 5,000 children and the 370 young women and the nameless babies' lost parents, all of them together, in the place the world had tried so hard to forget.